The St. Regis Singapore's ballroom glittered with $1 million worth of flowers imported from Ecuador and Holland. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across tables draped in ivory silk, each centerpiece a sculptural arrangement of white orchids and roses that cost more than most Singaporean families earned in a month. 700 guests in couture gowns and bespoke tuxedos sipped Dom Perignon Rose 2008. Their conversations a symphony of 5 languages: Mandarin, English, Hokkien, Malay, and the occasional burst of Tagalog from the small contingent of Filipino guests clustered awkwardly near the back tables. At the center of this opulent spectacle sat the bride, 19-year-old Maria Luz Santos, her hands trembling beneath layers of Belgian lace, as she forced her lips into a smile that didn't reach her terrified eyes. She wore a custom Vera Wang gown that weighed nearly 30 pounds. The seed pearls and crystals encrusting every inch of physical manifestation of the price her family had accepted for her virginity, her youth, and ultimately, her life. Beside her sat her husband of 3 hours, 62-year-old telecommunications magnate Vincent Tan, his weathered hand possessively gripping her thigh beneath the table while he laughed at jokes told by business associates who pretended not to notice his child bride's obvious distress. The wedding had cost $8.3 million, not including the $10 million bride price paid directly to Maria's family in the Philippines. Before the night ended, Maria would be dead, and the man who bought her would claim it was an accident. Maria Luz Santos was born on December 12, 1999, in the municipality of Tarlac City, central Luzon, during the tail end of a decade that had seen the Philippines struggle through economic crisis, political instability, and the ongoing exodus of millions of workers seeking opportunities abroad. She entered the world in a small concrete blockhouse with a corrugated metal roof that turned their 2 rooms into an oven during summer months and leaked like a sieve during typhoon season. Her mother, Lourdes, had been a domestic worker in Hong Kong for 6 years before Maria's birth, returning home only after becoming pregnant by a man who disappeared before acknowledging paternity. Her father, or the man who served that function, was Ramon Santos, Lourdes' cousin who married her in a civil ceremony that legitimized Maria's birth if not her conception. Ramon worked as a jeepney driver, navigating Tarlac's chaotic streets 14 hours daily for income that barely sustained their household. Maria was the eldest of 4 children born in rapid succession: herself, then brothers Miguel and Jose, and finally baby sister Angelica. Their childhood unfolded in that cramped house where privacy was theoretical, meals were carefully rationed, and new clothing appeared only as hand-me-downs from better-off relatives. But within their poverty existed fierce love and tight family bonds forged through shared struggle. Lourdes, despite her limited education, insisted all her children attend school properly. She woke at 4 a.m. daily to cook rice and dried fish for breakfast, pack meager lunches, and ensure school uniforms were washed and pressed despite having no washing machine or iron. She used a charcoal-heated metal press her grandmother had used before her. Maria exhibited unusual beauty from early childhood. By age 12, her features had refined into the kind of delicate loveliness that made neighbors stop mid-conversation to comment. Mestiza features, lighter skin than her siblings, larger eyes, a slender nose that suggested Spanish colonial ancestry somewhere in her bloodline. In a culture that prized these features, often cruelly, Maria's appearance drew attention that ranged from admiration to unsettling adult interest that made Lourdes increasingly protective and anxious. Secondary school for Maria meant attending Tarlac National High School, a 45-minute jeepney ride each way, the fares eating into family resources but considered essential investment in her future. She excelled academically despite overcrowded classrooms and insufficient textbooks, ranking in the top 10% of her class through natural intelligence and relentless studying by candlelight when electricity was cut for non-payment. Her teachers praised her aptitude for mathematics and science, suggesting she pursue nursing or teaching, professions that offered overseas employment opportunities and the possibility of lifting her entire family from poverty. But beauty complicated everything. By age 15, Maria couldn't walk to the market without enduring catcalls and inappropriate attention from men old enough to be her father. A local politician's son began following her home from school, his persistence crossing into harassment. Lourdes, terrified of what might happen to her daughter in a place where powerful men faced few consequences for exploiting poor girls, began keeping Maria home more frequently, assigning her childcare and housework that increasingly interfered with her education. The family's financial situation deteriorated dramatically when Ramon was injured in a jeepney accident in early 2017. A collision with a delivery truck left him with crushed vertebrae and permanent nerve damage that ended his ability to drive. The jeepney, which he'd been paying off through a predatory lending arrangement, was repossessed. His injury compensation, an insulting 50,000 pesos from the truck company's insurance, covered 2 months of medical expenses before evaporating entirely. Lured, desperate, returned to overseas work, accepting a domestic helper position in Singapore that paid 600 Singapore dollars monthly, but required her to leave her family for 2-year contracts with only one home visit annually. Maria, at 17, became surrogate mother to her siblings while managing her father's care and trying to continue her education. The stress was crushing. Miguel, then 13, began running with neighborhood boys involved in petty crime. Jose, 11, started skipping school. Baby Angelica, only 8, cried nightly for their mother. Medical bills for Ramon's pain medications and physical therapy consumed Lourdes' remittances before they could cover basic living expenses. The family fell behind on rent for the house they didn't own, facing eviction threats from a landlord who'd been patient but wasn't charitable. In this context of desperation, the marriage broker's visit in March 2018 seemed like divine intervention to a family drowning in impossible circumstances. Ms. Catalina Reyes presented herself as a matchmaking consultant specializing in international marriages between successful Asian businessmen and suitable Filipino brides. She arrived at the Santos home in a private car, dressed in expensive clothing that announced her success, carrying a leather portfolio and an iPad displaying photographs of previous matches she'd facilitated, Filipino girls, all young and beautiful, now living in Singapore, Malaysia, and Hong Kong. Their social media profiles showing lives of luxury their families back home could scarcely imagine. "Your daughter is exceptionally beautiful," Catalina told Lourdes and Ramon during their initial meeting, her eyes appraising Maria with the clinical assessment of someone evaluating merchandise. "I have a client in Singapore, a very successful businessman, who is seeking a wife from a good, traditional Filipino family. He values purity, modesty, and beauty. Maria possesses all 3 qualities." The financial terms Catalina outlined seemed fantastical, impossible, the kind of numbers that existed in news reports about lottery winners rather than real offers made to families like theirs. The prospective groom would pay a bride price of $10 million Singapore dollars, approximately 350 million pesos, transferred directly to the family upon marriage. Additionally, he would provide a home for Maria's family, educational funds for her siblings through university, and comprehensive medical care for Ramon. In exchange, he required a virgin bride, certified medically, who would sign a prenuptial agreement ensuring she received nothing if the marriage ended in divorce. Lourdes' initial response was immediate refusal. "My daughter is 17 years old. She's a child. I won't sell her to some old man like she's property." But Catalina was practiced at overcoming objections. She showed them the contracts signed by other families, testimonials from girls now living comfortably abroad, legal documents proving everything was legitimate rather than human trafficking. She explained that the groom, Mr. Vincent Tan, was a respectable 62-year-old widower whose first wife had died of cancer. He wanted a young bride who could give him children and companionship in his later years. The arrangement was traditional, culturally appropriate, and offered Maria opportunities she'd never accessed through normal circumstances. "Think about Miguel," Catalina said, her voice sympathetic but strategic. "Do you want him ending up in jail or worse because you can't afford to keep him in school and supervised? Think about Angelica. Without education, she'll repeat your struggles. And your husband's medical needs will only increase as he ages. This offer solves everything. Maria will live in luxury in Singapore. You'll have financial security. Her sacrifice saves your entire family." The word sacrifice hung in the air, revealing the transaction's true nature beneath its veneer of matchmaking and tradition. Over the following days, Catalina returned repeatedly, each visit bringing more persuasive materials: videos of Vincent Tan's Sentosa Cove mansion, financial statements proving his net worth exceeded $300 million. character references from business associates describing him as cultured and generous. She also brought subtle pressure, mentioning that Mr. Tan had other candidates under consideration, that this extraordinary opportunity wouldn't wait indefinitely. Maria herself was consulted only minimally. At 17, still several months from legal marriage age, her opinion was sought but not prioritized. When asked directly if she'd consider this arrangement, she looked at her father's face, gaunt with pain and shame at his inability to provide, at the eviction notice on their table, at her younger siblings whose futures hung in the balance. "If it helps my family," she said quietly, "I'll do whatever is necessary." The machinery of arrangement moved swiftly once the family agreed in principle. Medical examinations confirmed Maria's virginity through invasive procedures that humiliated her but were required by the contract. Psychological evaluations, conducted by a psychiatrist on Catalina's payroll, certified Maria as mentally competent to consent despite her youth and obvious distress during the assessment. Legal documents were prepared by Singaporean lawyers, the prenuptial agreement so comprehensive and one-sided that any attorney representing Maria's interests would have advised immediate refusal. But she had no independent legal counsel, only Catalina's assurances that everything was standard and fair. The money began flowing before the wedding. An initial payment of 50 million pesos appeared in a new bank account opened in Lourdes' name, earnest money demonstrating Vincent Tan's serious intentions and ensuring the Santos family's cooperation. With this windfall, they paid all debts, purchased their rental house outright, enrolled Miguel and Jose in private school with boarding arrangements that removed them from negative influences, and secured comprehensive medical care for Ramon, including surgeries that had been financially impossible before. The family's transformation was dramatic and immediate. Neighbors who'd once looked down on them now offered congratulations and requests for loans. Relatives who'd maintained distance suddenly became attentive and friendly. The Santos family was rising, their poverty erased by Maria's willingness to marry a man she'd never met who was 3 times her age. Maria's 18th birthday on December 12, 2017, was celebrated quietly with family, but it marked a legal milestone that made the marriage contract valid. 2 months later, in February 2018, she traveled to Singapore for the first time, chaperoned by Catalina, meeting Vincent Tan at his office in the Central Business District for what was framed as a getting-to-know-you meeting but felt more like a final inspection before purchase. Vincent Tan Kong Huat had built his fortune through timing, ruthlessness, and the kind of opportunistic intelligence that recognized telecommunications infrastructure would define Asia's economic future before most investors understood the industry's potential. Born in 1956 to a middle-class Peranakan family in Katong, he'd attended Raffles Institution and the National University of Singapore before earning an MBA from INSEAD. His first company, established in 1985, provided telecommunications equipment to Singapore's rapidly modernizing business sector. Through strategic partnerships, aggressive acquisition of competitors, and close relationships with government officials who controlled infrastructure contracts, Vincent had grown his initial modest operation into Tancom Industries, a telecommunications conglomerate with operations across Southeast Asia valued at over $800 million. His first marriage, to Margaret Lim, daughter of a prominent Singaporean banking family, had been arranged by their parents and proved successful by traditional measures. They produced 2 children, son Brandon, now 34 and serving as Tancom's chief operating officer, and daughter Melissa, 32, a corporate lawyer married to a government minister. Margaret had been the perfect wife for an ambitious businessman. Sophisticated, socially connected, adept at hosting the dinner parties and charity events that cemented business relationships. Her death from ovarian cancer in 2016, after a brutal 2-year battle, had been genuinely mourned by Vincent, who'd loved her in his way despite the marriage's transactional origins. But Margaret's death also liberated Vincent to pursue desires he'd suppressed during their marriage. His wealth and status had always attracted female attention: secretaries, business associates, the wives of acquaintances who saw him as successful and attractive despite his advancing age. He'd indulged occasionally, discreetly, affairs that Margaret had likely known about but never acknowledged because their marriage's stability mattered more than fidelity. After her death, Vincent's interests had turned increasingly toward much younger women. His dating attempts met with rejection by age-appropriate partners who saw him as too old, too traditional, too controlling. The suggestion that he seek a bride through international matchmaking had come from a business associate who'd successfully married a Thai woman 30 years his junior. The arrangement worked perfectly, his friend explained. Young Southeast Asian women from poor families valued security over romance, accepted traditional gender roles without Western feminist complications, and brought youth and beauty that rejuvenated their older husbands. The transaction was clear: money and stability in exchange for companionship, domestic service, and sexual availability. Everyone understood the terms, making the relationship more honest than modern marriages built on romantic illusions that inevitably disappointed. Vincent had contacted Catalina Reyes's agency in late 2017, specifying his requirements. A Filipina bride? He'd always found Filipino women particularly beautiful and culturally compatible with Singapore's values. Between 18 and 25 years old, virgin, certified medically, educated enough for basic conversation but not so educated she'd challenge his authority, and from a poor enough family that the bride price would ensure loyalty and gratitude. He was offering financial security that would transform her entire family's circumstances. In return, he expected a wife who understood her role: hostess for his social obligations, mother to children he still hoped to father, and sexually available without the complications of a partner who might have her own desires or demands. When Catalina showed him Maria's photograph and background information, Vincent felt the stirring of interest that had been absent during previous candidate reviews. She was extraordinarily beautiful, her youth and innocence apparent even through photographs. Her family situation was desperate enough to ensure cooperation. And critically, she was still 17. He'd have to wait a few months for legal marriage, but this delay only heightened his anticipation. He was buying unspoiled youth, purchasing the experience of being first, claiming something precious that would belong exclusively to him. Their first meeting in February 2018 confirmed his decision. Maria, dressed modestly in a simple dress Catalina had selected, sat across from him in his office conference room, her eyes downcast in the deferent manner he found appealing. She answered his questions in soft, respectful tones. Yes, she understood the marriage expectations. Yes, she was willing to convert to his Methodist denomination. Yes, she hoped to be a good wife and mother. Her nervousness was palpable, which Vincent found endearing rather than concerning. She would adjust. They always did once they understood their new circumstances. He'd taken her to dinner at a high-end restaurant, Catalina chaperoning to maintain propriety, where Maria picked at expensive food with obvious discomfort while Vincent described the life she'd have as his wife. The Sentosa Cove mansion with ocean views. Shopping at Paragon and Takashimaya with unlimited budgets. Travel to his business interests in Malaysia, Thailand, and Indonesia. Children who would attend Singapore's best schools and inherit his considerable wealth. She listened with the attention of someone being told about someone else's life, unable to imagine these luxuries as her own future reality. The wedding was scheduled for June 2018, giving them 4 months to complete the legal requirements, finalize the financial arrangements, and allow Maria to adjust to the idea of her new life. Vincent paid the full $10 million bride price in March. The money transferred to accounts in Lourdes' name with legal documents ensuring the Santos family's cooperation and Maria's compliance. The contract was explicit. If Maria refused to consummate the marriage or attempted to leave within the first 5 years, the entire bride price would be refunded immediately, bankrupting her family and voiding all the security his money had purchased. Vincent's children reacted to the engagement announcement with predictable horror. Brandon, professional and diplomatic in business settings, unleashed his fury in private. "She's younger than my daughter, Dad. This is grotesque. You're not buying a wife, you're buying a prostitute. This will destroy our family's reputation." Melissa was even more direct. "Mom's been dead 2 years and you're replacing her with a teenager? I can't even look at you right now. This is sick." But Vincent had anticipated their objections and felt no need to justify his choices to adult children who'd already received their inheritances and positions in his company. He was 62 years old, wealthy, and entitled to structure his personal life however he chose. If his children couldn't understand that loneliness drove his decision or accept that May-December marriages were traditional across Asian cultures, that was their problem, not his. The wedding planning proceeded with the efficiency money could purchase. Event planners transformed the St. Regis Ballroom. Vera Wong's atelier created a custom gown. Invitations went to 700 guests. Business associates, government officials, society figures who might privately judge, but would publicly celebrate because Vincent's wealth and influence demanded their attendance. The Filipino contingent was small: Maria's immediate family, a few relatives, and the priest from their Tarlac parish whom Vincent flew business class to co-officiate the ceremony alongside his Methodist minister, creating an ecumenical service that satisfied both religious traditions. Maria arrived in Singapore 1 week before the wedding, installed in a guest suite at Vincent's mansion. Their separation before marriage maintained for propriety despite the transaction underlying everything. She spent those days in fittings, rehearsals, and etiquette coaching from a consultant Vincent hired to ensure his bride wouldn't embarrass him through social mistakes. Maria absorbed the instructions with quiet compliance, her fear growing daily as the reality of what she'd agreed to crystallized. The wedding day itself, June 16, 2018, unfolded with choreographed perfection until the private moments began. The ceremony was traditional and elaborate, Maria's voice barely audible as she recited vows written by Vincent's lawyers rather than spoken from her heart. The reception featured performances by a string quartet, a celebrity Singaporean singer, and a fireworks display over Marina Bay that cost $200,000 for 15 minutes of explosions. Guests toasted the couple with champagne and speeches that praised Vincent's success, while tactfully avoiding his bride's age or the obvious commercial nature of their union. Maria endured it all with the dissociated numbness of someone watching events happen to someone else. Her family's joy at their transformed circumstances provided her only comfort. Her mother resplendent in an expensive gown Vincent had purchased, her father walking without visible pain thanks to successful surgery, her siblings polished and happy in ways that justified her sacrifice. She was saving them. This was her purpose. She could endure anything knowing they were finally secure. The wedding night began when Vincent's driver delivered them to the Sentosa Cove mansion at 11:47 p.m. The staff had prepared the master suite with rose petals, champagne, and the kind of romantic staging that mocked the transaction everyone understood was occurring. Vincent dismissed the household staff, ensuring privacy for what would follow. Maria stood in the center of the bedroom, still wearing her 30-pound gown because she didn't know how to remove it alone, trembling visibly as Vincent approached. "You're my wife now," he said, his voice carrying satisfaction and anticipation. "Everything about you belongs to me. Your virginity, your body, your future. Do you understand?" Maria nodded, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. Vincent interpreted her crying as bridal nervousness rather than terror, his arousal increasing at her obvious innocence and fear. This was what he'd paid for, the experience of claiming something pure and unspoiled, of being first and only, of possessing rather than sharing. The sexual assault that followed, and assault was the accurate term despite its legal designation as marital consummation, was brutal in its disregard for Maria's pain, fear, or humanity. Vincent's excitement at claiming his virgin bride overrode any consideration for her experience. When Maria cried out in pain, he interpreted it as expected defloration discomfort rather than genuine suffering requiring him to stop. When she begged him to slow down, he mistook her pleas for shyness rather than distress. When she began hyperventilating, panic attack symptoms obvious to anyone with basic empathy, Vincent was too focused on his own pleasure to notice. The medical examiner would later determine that the physical trauma Maria experienced during that encounter was severe. Vaginal tearing, internal bruising, and hemorrhaging that, had she survived, would have required immediate surgical intervention. But the physical damage was accompanied by psychological shock, so profound that Maria's system began shutting down. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. Her heart rate, already elevated by fear, began racing at dangerous levels. She was experiencing a severe panic attack complicated by physical trauma, her body's stress response triggering a cascade of physiological reactions that Vincent, in his self-absorbed state, failed to recognize as medical emergency. When Vincent finally finished and rolled away satisfied, Maria lay motionless, her breathing barely perceptible. "You'll feel better soon," he murmured, already drifting towards sleep, his 62-year-old body exhausted by exertion. The first time is always difficult, but you'll adjust. You're my wife now. This is your duty. Maria didn't respond because she couldn't. Her panic attack had progressed to the point where her body's oxygen levels were dropping dangerously low. The combination of extreme psychological stress, severe physical trauma, and the physiological response her system had triggered was creating a perfect storm of medical crisis. She needed immediate emergency medical intervention, recognition of her distress, administration of oxygen, psychological crisis support, and treatment for her physical injuries. Instead, Vincent fell asleep beside her, his snoring filling the room while his 19-year-old bride died slowly over the next 40 minutes from a combination of shock, internal hemorrhaging, and respiratory failure triggered by extreme trauma. By the time household staff discovered the situation the following morning, entering the master suite at 7 a.m. with breakfast trays to find Vincent still sleeping beside Maria's cold body, she had been dead for nearly 7 hours. The investigation that followed Vincent Tan's call to emergency services at 7:14 a.m. on June 17, 2018, was complicated by the wealth, status, and political connections of the primary subject. The responding officers from the Singapore police force found Vincent in his study, dressed in an expensive robe, visibly shaken but already composing himself with the control of someone accustomed to managing crises. His statement was brief and carefully worded. He and his bride had consummated their marriage the previous night. He'd fallen asleep afterward, and he'd discovered her unresponsive when he woke. He assumed she died peacefully in her sleep, perhaps from an undiagnosed medical condition. He was devastated, shocked, and requesting discretion given his family's prominent position. The crime scene, though initially not treated as a crime scene, told a more disturbing story. Maria's body lay in the master bedroom, the sheets beneath her stained with blood that had soaked through multiple layers. Her eyes were open, her face frozen in an expression of fear rather than peaceful death. The 30-pound Vera Wang gown lay crumpled on the floor where Vincent had eventually removed it. The room's romantic staging, rose petals, champagne, created a jarring contrast with the evidence of trauma visible even to responding officers without medical training. The preliminary medical examination conducted at the scene noted multiple concerning findings. Significant vaginal trauma inconsistent with gentle first sexual experience, bruising on Maria's wrists and thighs suggesting forceful restraint, and petechial hemorrhaging in her eyes indicating extreme stress before death. The attending physician on scene immediately recommended treating the death as suspicious pending full autopsy, but this recommendation encountered resistance from senior officers aware of Vincent Tan's connections to government officials who could make careers difficult for investigators who embarrass powerful citizens. The autopsy performed by Dr. Sarah Chun, chief forensic pathologist at the Health Sciences Authority, was thorough and unambiguous in its findings. Cause of death was determined to be respiratory and cardiac failure triggered by extreme psychological and physical trauma. The vaginal injuries were consistent with violent sexual assault rather than consensual intercourse between a careful experienced partner and a virgin bride. The internal hemorrhaging was severe enough that Maria would have required immediate medical intervention to survive. Most damningly, the timeline established through body temperature, rigor mortis, and other forensic indicators showed Maria had died somewhere between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., meaning she'd lain dying for hours while Vincent slept beside her, her suffering ignored or unnoticed. Dr. Chen's report concluded with a professional but pointed observation. The deceased experienced catastrophic medical emergency resulting from severe physical and psychological trauma sustained during sexual activity. The failure to recognize and respond to obvious distress signals represents negligence rising to the level of criminal culpability. This death was preventable with appropriate care and attention to the victim's welfare. The criminal investigation faced immediate pressure from multiple directions. Vincent's legal team, led by one of Singapore's most expensive criminal defense attorneys, argued that the death was a tragic accident during lawful marital relations, that Vincent bore no criminal responsibility for unforeseeable medical complications, and that prosecuting a grieving widower for engaging in legally sanctioned activity with his wife would be unconscionable. They hinted at defamation lawsuits, political consequences for overzealous investigators, and reminded everyone of Vincent's charitable contributions and respected position in Singaporean society. Simultaneously, Filipino advocacy groups and human rights organizations began mobilizing. Maria's death, Once news leaked through hospital staff and investigative reports, became international news. Headlines screamed, "Teen bride dies on wedding night after being sold to Singapore tycoon." "Virgin bride's deadly wedding night exposes dark side of marriage brokers." And, "Did Singapore billionaire kill his Filipino child bride?" The coverage cast harsh light on the international bride trade, the exploitation of desperately poor families, and the question of whether what had occurred constituted rape, negligent homicide, or even murder. The Santos family, devastated and confused, found themselves trapped between grief and guilt. Lourdes collapsed upon receiving news of her daughter's death, requiring hospitalization for severe anxiety and depression. Ramon, unable to process that the decision meant to save his family had instead killed his daughter, attempted suicide through medication overdose, and survived only due to timely intervention by his son Miguel. The $10 million bride price that had transformed their lives now felt like blood money, cursed wealth purchased at the cost of Maria's life. The investigation expanded to include Catalina Reyes and her matchmaking agency. Financial records revealed a network connecting desperate Filipino families with wealthy older men across Asia. The arrangement structured to appear legal while exploiting power imbalances and economic desperation. Catalina's commission on Maria's match had been $500,000, 5% of the bride price, with evidence suggesting dozens of similar transactions over the previous decade. Some had ended in seemingly stable marriages, but investigators discovered at least 3 other cases where young brides had experienced severe abuse, attempted suicide, or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The legal proceedings that followed became a flashpoint for debates about exploitation, consent, and justice in cases involving vast wealth disparities. Vincent was ultimately charged with causing death by negligent act, a charge that carried maximum penalties of 2 years imprisonment but acknowledged that his actions didn't constitute intentional murder. The prosecution argued that Vincent's failure to recognize or respond to Maria's obvious medical distress represented criminal negligence, that a reasonable person would have known continued sexual activity despite his partner's evident pain and fear was dangerous and wrong, and that his decision to sleep rather than seek help for his clearly suffering bride demonstrated reckless disregard for her life. The defense countered that Maria's death resulted from unforeseeable medical complications, that Vincent couldn't have known about her underlying propensity for severe panic attacks, despite no evidence such propensity existed, and that prosecuting a man for engaging in sexual relations with his legal wife set dangerous precedent that could criminalize normal marital intimacy. They portrayed Vincent as a grieving widower, his intentions honorable, his actions consistent with cultural norms around arranged marriages and wedding night expectations. The trial lasted 8 weeks and featured testimony that laid bare the entire sordid transaction. Medical experts detailed Maria's injuries and suffering. Psychologists explained trauma responses and the power dynamics in relationships with massive age and economic disparities. Catalina Reyes, granted immunity in exchange for testimony, described the bride trade's mechanics, how families' desperation was exploited, how young girls were groomed to accept arrangements they couldn't meaningfully consent to, how wealthy men specifically sought virgins young enough to be their granddaughters. The Santos family, testifying through tears, described their desperation and their guilt, the impossible choice between watching their children suffer through poverty or sacrificing their eldest daughter to a man who'd ultimately kill her. Vincent himself testified briefly, his legal team limiting his exposure to cross-examination. He expressed genuine sorrow about Maria's death, insisted he'd loved her in his way, and maintained that he'd believed their wedding night encounter was proceeding normally despite her obvious distress. When asked directly why he'd fallen asleep rather than seeking medical help for his bleeding, traumatized bride, Vincent claimed exhaustion and assumption that first-time sexual discomfort was normal and temporary. His lack of genuine remorse was evident to observers, his primary concern appearing to be his reputation rather than the life he'd taken through negligence and self-absorption. The verdict, delivered in March 2019, found Vincent guilty of causing death by negligent act. The judge's sentencing remarks were scathing. The defendant treated his bride as purchased property rather than a human being deserving of care and respect. His actions on their wedding night demonstrated callous disregard for her suffering and dignity. While the evidence doesn't support a murder conviction, his negligence directly caused a preventable death. The power imbalance in this relationship, the economic exploitation that created it, and the defendant's failure to recognize his bride's humanity combine to make this case particularly egregious. Vincent was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment and fined $500,000 Singapore dollars, the maximum penalties available under the charge. Additionally, he was ordered to pay $5 million in restitution to Maria's family, returning half the bride price as acknowledgement of his breach of the marriage contract's implicit promise to care for his purchased bride. The sentence was widely criticized as too lenient, 18 months for a life, but represented the limits of Singapore's legal framework for addressing what had occurred. Catalina Reyes and her agency faced criminal charges for operating an illegal matchmaking service that facilitated exploitation. She was convicted, sentenced to 3 years imprisonment, and her agency permanently shut down. Investigations into similar operations across Southeast Asia led to reforms in marriage visa regulations, increased scrutiny of international matchmaking services, and greater protection for foreign brides entering Singapore through arranged marriages. Vincent served 11 months of his sentence before being released for good behavior. His business suffered minimal impact. Tancom Industries continued operating profitably under Brandon's management, though Vincent's personal reputation never recovered. He became persona non grata in Singapore's social circles. His children maintained distance, and his final years were marked by isolation and the kind of loneliness his purchase of Maria had been meant to alleviate. He died in 2022 of heart failure, his obituaries noting his business achievements while carefully mentioning the scandal that had destroyed his legacy. Maria Luz Santos's body was returned to the Philippines for burial in Tarlac City. Her funeral was attended by thousands, a mixture of family, community members, and strangers who'd been moved by her story. She was buried in a custom mausoleum purchased with the restitution money, the structure serving as memorial to her sacrifice and warning about the exploitation of desperately poor families by wealthy predators. Her grave marker reads, Maria Luz Santos, December 12, 1999 to June 17, 2018. Beloved daughter and sister. Her life was stolen by those who valued money over humanity. The Santos family used the restitution funds to establish the Maria Luz Foundation, an organization providing financial support to impoverished Filipino families as an alternative to selling their daughters into exploitative marriages. The foundation offers microloans, educational scholarships, and emergency assistance designed to prevent the desperation that had made Maria's sacrifice seem necessary. Through this work, her death created legacy beyond tragedy, though no amount of good works could ease her family's guilt and grief. The questions Maria's death raises remain uncomfortable and largely unresolved. How do we protect young people from exploitation when economic desperation makes them vulnerable? What consent means when power imbalances are so vast that refusal isn't realistically possible? Whether cultural traditions around arranged marriage can coexist with modern understandings of human rights and dignity. The answers remain elusive, but Maria's story serves a stark reminder that some prices are too high to pay, that some traditions perpetuate exploitation rather than honor culture, and that wealth without humanity is just another form of poverty. If you know a family considering such arrangements for their daughters, please connect them with advocacy organizations before desperation leads to irreversible decisions. If you're a young woman facing pressure to accept an arranged marriage with massive power imbalances, know that your life and dignity matter more than your family's financial security. Help exists, alternatives are available, and your worth isn't measured by the price someone will pay to own you. Maria Luz Santos was 19 years old, beautiful, intelligent, and full of potential when she was purchased, traumatized, and killed by a man who saw her as property rather than person. Her story deserves to be remembered not as cautionary entertainment but as indictment of systems that allow such exploitation and call to action for those who can prevent future tragedies. May she rest in peace. May her family find healing. And may we build a world where no daughter's life is ever valued less than the money she might bring her family through her destruction.